While the mainstream boomer shooters get the spotlight, the indie GZDoom scene has quietly been out here building entire worlds, surreal, brutal, stylish, and often way more experimental than most. These aren't just mods anymore. These are full games, complete experiences crafted by tiny teams with ridiculous amounts of passion. There are 3 early access titles that deserve a mention: Supplice, Sulaco, Relentless Frontier. But since they aren't fully released, I didn't include them in the actual list. If you're a boomer shooter fan who loves speed, atmosphere, and weird ideas pushed to their absolute limit, these are the 12 indie GZDoom games you absolutely need to play. If you end up liking the content, please subscribe for more, and I'd appreciate it if you give it a thumbs up and tell me what you think down below. Love to hear it. Vomitorium feels like someone blended Metroid Prime, Dark Souls, and a fever dream, then pumped the result through a GZDoom bloodstream. It's a fully realized Metroidvania built inside the engine, complete with backtracking, permanent upgrades, interconnected zones, and eerie, fleshy environments that feel alive even when nothing moves. The world is drenched in this sickly, post-apocalyptic atmosphere where cities crumble under organic corruption and the sky looks like it's rotting. Every area feels handcrafted to unsettle you. Narrow, bone-like corridors, abandoned plazas twisted by infection, industrial tunnels that feel like something once crawled through them and forgot to leave. Combat is slower and more deliberate than standard boomer shooters, but that's the point. This wants you to feel tension. Enemies meld into smoke when killed, leaving behind ghostly echoes that look cool but keep you on edge. Boss fights hit with that classic boomer shooter punch, but the real magic is exploration. Upgrades genuinely change how you traverse the world, giving a sense of progression most shooters don't even attempt. But it's not without flaws. Some backtracking can feel repetitive, and certain areas stretch out longer than they need to. A few players bounce off the intentionally minimal storytelling, and the pacing occasionally dips in quieter sections. Still, the game's atmosphere and ambition make it something special. Vomitorium doesn't try to compete with modern shooters. It wants to feel like a lost nightmare you wander through alone, and it succeeds in a way few GZDoom projects ever have. If you want a shooter that isn't afraid to be slow, surreal, and deeply weird, this one belongs at the top of your list. Shrine 1 and 2 are some of the purest, rawest expressions of cosmic horror boomer shooting you'll ever find in GZDoom. A pair of games that feel like they were carved out of bone, ink, and nightmare logic. Everything is drenched in this hand-drawn, monochrome, almost occult aesthetic that immediately sets them apart. Enemies don't just look strange. They look wrong. Shambling masses of ritual markings, fleshy idols, twisted silhouettes, and cultist horrors that feel like they crawled out of a haunted sketchbook. Levels are tight, fast, and mean, pushing you through twisted temples, blood-soaked catacombs, void realms, and geometric hellscapes where the architecture seems to rearrange itself when you're not looking. Combat is incredibly punchy. Weapons feel improvised, yet deadly. Bone rifles that kick like a mule, flesh cannons with organic recoil, curse staves that belch distorted projectiles, and melee tools that cleave through eldritch creatures with disgusting satisfaction. The pacing is relentless, sending you sprinting from encounter to encounter with barely enough time to reload before another pack of horrors charges you. Shrine 2 expands everything. Bigger levels, more grotesque enemies, smoother pacing, and weapons that feel twice as refined. It's a full evolution rather than just a sequel. They're not perfect. Shrine 1's difficulty spikes can feel unfair, with some levels throwing too many enemies into cramped hallways where you have no room to breathe. The art style, while incredible, can hurt readability, especially during chaotic fights where black and white sprites blur together. Shrine 2 fixes some of this, but still suffers from the same issue when the screen fills with particles and overlapping enemy sprites. The storytelling stays intentionally cryptic, which works for the atmosphere, but will leave lore-focused players wanting more. Still, no other GZDoom projects look or feel anything like the Shrine games. They're surreal, grotesque energy, aggressive pacing, and hand-drawn nightmare aesthetic make them unforgettable. If you want shooters that feel alien, unfiltered, and soaked in pure creative chaos, Shrine 1 and 2 should be at the top of the list. Malapitaka is the exact opposite. Loud, fast, colorful, and chaotic in a way few retro shooters dare to be. It's a hyperactive explosion of movement and style, drenched in neon sprites and old-school arcade energy. You blast through waves of bizarre aliens in arenas filled with jump pads, tight corners, wide-open kill zones, and explosive props that turn firefights into pure, gleeful mayhem. The movement speed is cranked up so high that combat becomes a dance, circle strafing, bunny hopping, baiting enemy projectiles, and chaining kills together with barely a second to catch your breath. It feels like someone mashed together classic Doom, PSX arena shooters, and late-night cartoon chaos. What makes it special is how readable the chaos is. Even with bright particle effects and dozens of enemies on screen, the visual language is clear enough that you can track the flow of combat without getting lost. Weapons all have unique roles, from rapid-fire precision guns to chunky explosive launchers, and switching between them mid-fight becomes second nature. Levels are bite-sized but well-crafted, keeping you in that perfect rhythm of quick encounters, satisfying kill streaks, and momentum-heavy platforming. It's not flawless. The art style, while fun, isn't for everyone. Some players find the ultra-bright palette overwhelming. The story is minimal and intentionally goofy, which fits the tone but won't grab anyone looking for depth. A few late-game arenas spike the difficulty hard, filling narrow spaces with too many projectile enemies at once. And because the game leans so heavily on speed, players who prefer slower, more tactical shooters may bounce off early. Still, Malapitaka is pure joy. Fast, silly, stylish, and unashamedly energetic. If you want a boomer shooter that emphasizes mobility and chaos above all else, this is one of the most entertaining things ever built in GZDoom. Lycanthorn 2 is pure, hyper-stylized energy. A fast, punchy retro action game that mixes Castlevania, classic 3D platformers, and 90s anime aesthetics into something that shouldn't work, but absolutely does. It moves at a breakneck pace, almost like a speedrunner's dream, with levels built around dashing, double jumping, slicing, and launching magic attacks while enemies explode in bright color splashes. Where most GZDoom shooters lean into darker atmospheres, this feels electric. Bright neon skies, gothic castles, moonlit villages, icy peaks, and surreal dream realms stitched together into a fever-pitch world that encourages non-stop forward momentum. What makes it click is how tight the movement feels. There's a rhythm to the combat. Dash in, strike, leap away, throw a spell, chain it into another dash. It's fast, but readable, and the game rewards aggression instead of timid corner peeking. The boss fights are highlights. Big, stylish monsters with attack patterns closer to retro action games than pure FPS design. The soundtrack leans fully into that anime-infused, synth-goth flavor, pushing the pacing even harder. But the speed does come with drawbacks. Some platforming sections can be brutally unforgiving due to the engine's quirks, and a single missed input can send you back farther than you'd like. A few levels lean too heavily on tight jumps or enemy spam, which may frustrate players expecting a more traditional boomer shooter layout. The story is intentionally thin and over the top, which fits the tone but won't click for everyone. Enemy AI isn't always consistent, and the difficulty sometimes spikes in ways that feel abrupt. Even with those caveats, Lycanthorn 2 stands out because it commits to its own style completely. It's fast, loud, stylish, unapologetic, and unlike anything else built in GZDoom. If you want a retro FPS that feels more like a hyperactive anime-inspired action blast than a standard shooter, this is the one that will hook you instantly. Hands of Necromancy 1 and 2 take the familiar GZDoom foundation and twists it into a full hybrid of old-school FPS chaos and classic fantasy RPG progression. You start with weak spells and basic weapons, but every region you conquer adds new forms, abilities, and tools that completely change how you approach combat. Transformations aren't just gimmicks. Each one shifts your mobility, your offense, and even your access to certain areas, giving the game this steady rhythm of discovery that keeps pulling you deeper. One minute you're blasting undead in a crypt, the next you're navigating lava chambers using a form that shouldn't logically survive there. It feels like a messy, ambitious love letter to Heretic and Hexen, but with heavier feedback and more emphasis on constant experimentation. What makes it stand out is how flexible the playstyle becomes. Spells feel weighty, melee hits sound like they're cracking bone, and enemies swarm fast enough to force quick decisions rather than lazy circle strafing. Levels are interconnected but not confusing. They're wide enough to give you freedom but contain enough to keep momentum high. The world has this grim fantasy charm, full of cursed towns, ruined temples, forgotten crypts, and elemental realms that feel hand-built by someone who genuinely loves the genre. It does have flaws. Some of the transformations aren't balanced equally, and a few puzzles can break the pacing if you're not paying attention. Enemy variety dips here and there, which can make some stretches feel repetitive, especially if you lean too heavily on one favorite form. Visual clarity sometimes takes a hit when effects overlap, and new players might find the structure a bit opaque at first. But these issues never overwhelm the core experience. These two are weird, creative, and confidently old school, and anyone craving a blend of fantasy and classic shooter aggression will lose hours to it without noticing. Morta is one of the most ambitious and visually striking GZDoom projects in years. A grimdark, high-fantasy shooter that feels like a cross between old school, Witch-Haven brutality, and modern Doom's aggressive combat flow. It throws you into bleak medieval battlegrounds, haunted forests, cursed monasteries, and massive citadels drowning in undead hordes. The world is dirty, violent, and atmospheric, with thick fog, dynamic lighting, and a color palette that leans heavily into muddy browns, deep reds, and sickly greens. It's a gritty universe where every stone wall and rusted blade feels soaked in centuries of misery. What makes it special is its weight. Combat is slower and heavier than most boomer shooters. Melee weapons crack skulls with crunchy impact sounds, sending blood spray across the environment, while ranged weapons feel equally devastating. Crossbows, spell cannons, black powder rifles, and other medieval contraptions that hit hard and demand accuracy. The enemy roster is varied. Undead knights, demonic beasts, twisted monks, and armored horrors that require positioning and timing rather than blind aggression. Boss fights are intense, often built around attack patterns that reward patience instead of mindless strafing. The game's scale is surprising. Levels feel grand and interconnected, with verticality, secrets tucked behind breakable walls, side passages, and environmental storytelling reminiscent of early From Software design. But that ambition brings flaws too. Some levels run long, with sparse checkpoints, causing frustration on death. A few areas get too dark, pushing atmosphere into borderline visual murkiness. Enemy placement occasionally leans into unfair ambushes, especially when projectile spam mixes with tight hallways. And though the art style is consistent, certain sprites clash slightly with others due to differing levels of detail. Even with those issues, Morta stands as one of the most impressive GZDoom releases in recent years. Dismantled is a grim, industrial horror shooter that pushes GZDoom into a place that's far more unsettling than the engine seems built for. Everything in this game feels damp, metallic, and hostile, from the rust-crusted corridors to the thudding mechanical drones that stalk you through abandoned facilities. It takes inspiration from Quake's darker moments and mixes them with System Shock-style tension, giving you long stretches of eerie quiet before throwing you into brutal, claustrophobic combat encounters. Weapons fire with a harsh, metallic punch, and enemies don't just run at you. They scramble, hiss, or clatter through vents, making every shadow feel like a threat. The pacing is what sets it apart. It doesn't bombard you with enemies. Instead, it lets the environment do most of the work. Flickering lights, distant machinery, low reverb hums, and environmental storytelling pieces make the world feel alive in a deeply uncomfortable way. Rooms feel like they've been used, then abandoned for reasons you never quite learn. Combat is rough, messy, and unforgiving. You're not a super soldier. You feel more like a survivor trying to improvise through toxic industrial hellscapes one room at a time. Its imperfections show the limits of the engine. Some areas feel too dark, pushing atmosphere into occasional frustration. Level geometry can get confusing, especially in more maze-like industrial sections. Enemy pathing occasionally gets buggy due to the cramped level design, making some fights feel unpredictable in ways the dev never intended. The story, while intriguing, remains fragmented, leaving you to interpret a lot of the world's meaning on your own. Still, Dismantled stands out by committing completely to its oppressive atmosphere. If you like shooters that make you feel small, vulnerable, and constantly unsure of what's around the next corner, this is one of the most haunting hidden gems. Memoirs of Magic is what happens when someone looks at classic JRPGs, old-school adventure games, and colorful 90s shooters and decides to cram all of that into a single, explosively charming GZDoom project. This thing is massive, a full-length adventure with a dozen playable classes, sprawling overworld zones, friendly NPCs, secret-filled dungeons, and boss battles that feel closer to Final Fantasy than Doom. The combat is where Memoirs really shines. Every class has distinct abilities: magical glass cannons, heavy weapon bruisers, fast melee fighters, summoners, weird utility builds, and you can switch them freely. This creates a constant sense of discovery, fueling experimentation as you figure out which playstyle fits each dungeon or enemy type. The world is huge, sometimes shockingly so for a GZDoom project, with hand-drawn art, colorful sprites, and whimsical environments that feel like they came out of a lost SNES RPG. Boss fights are big, dramatic, and full of flashy attacks that force you to learn patterns rather than rely on pure twitch reflexes. Of course, the game's ambition also leads to unevenness. Some zones are too large for their own good, stretching out travel times and making progression feel sluggish. Difficulty can swing wildly between bosses and regular encounters, especially depending on which class you're using. Inventory clutter becomes a problem as you accumulate items faster than the interface can comfortably handle. And because the game borrows so much from RPG structure, players expecting non-stop boomer shooter pacing might find parts of it slow. Even with these quirks, Memoirs of Magic stands out as one of the boldest, most joyful things ever built on this engine. And if you want creativity, scale, and pure indie heart, this is a journey you absolutely shouldn't skip. Wrecker, Sunken Land is one of the most astonishing reinventions of the GZDoom engine. A full conversion that discards demons and sci-fi entirely for a mythic, Norse-inspired world drowning in frozen seas, haunted ruins, and ancient magic. Everything feels handcrafted with an almost obsessive level of detail. Textures, sprites, sound design, UI, weapon animations, all stylized to feel like a gritty Viking saga told through a lost 90s PC game. You explore harsh, coastal villages, storm-beaten temples, shipwrecked graveyards, and subterranean caverns filled with monstrous creatures that look like they crawled straight out of some half-remembered folktale. It's one of the rare GZDoom projects where the world itself carries as much weight as the gunplay. Combat is snappy and satisfying, mixing fast projectiles, brutal melee swings, and explosive weapons that feel carved out of bone and iron. The level design balances linear progression with exploration, rewarding players who poke into side paths with secrets, shortcuts, or glimpses of the world's deeper lore. The music sells the atmosphere even more. A mix of mournful chanting, tribal percussion, and icy ambience that makes every fight feel like a desperate clash on the edge of the world. It isn't without its caveats. Some levels can get maze-like, especially when the game leans heavily into its older-school labyrinth tendencies. A few enemy types blur together at a glance, since the color palette stays intentionally muted, and late-game difficulty spikes can feel abrupt if you aren't stocked up on resources. Story elements are present, but understated, leaving the narrative feeling fragmented unless you piece it together yourself. Yet despite those rough edges, Sunken Land stands as one of the most polished and cohesive total conversions ever released. It doesn't feel like Doom with a new skin. It feels like an entirely different retro FPS that just happens to use the same engine. For anyone who wants atmosphere, lore, and world building as thick as the combat itself, this is required playing. Head and Bloodright is one of the most complete and polished GZDoom titles ever created. A massive dark fantasy FPS that blends Hexen, Unreal, and classic PC dungeon crawlers into something rich, moody, and genuinely epic. Instead of corridors and arenas, you're exploring sprawling underground caverns, ancient citadels, fungal forests, frozen mines, and witch-haunted ruins. The levels are huge, almost overwhelming at times, filled with secrets and branching paths that beg you to slow down and breathe in the world. It doesn't rush you. It wants you to live in these places. The arsenal is heavy and satisfying, mixing brutal melee combat with chunky magic weapons that feel pulled from some long-forgotten fantasy rulebook. You play as a powerful warrior orc, which instantly sets it apart from the usual Doom-derived protagonists, and the writing leans into that world building with surprising confidence. The soundtrack is moody, tribal, atmospheric, sometimes almost meditative, while monsters hit hard enough to keep you constantly alert. But this has its share of caveats. Some of the puzzles get notoriously obscure, especially in the later chapters, where you might spend more time deciphering cryptic clues than actually shooting things. The game's scale can be overwhelming, and players expecting tight, linear boomer shooter pacing might struggle with its slower, exploratory nature. And because it's so ambitious, not every area hits the same high mark. Even so, Head and Bloodright is one of the crown jewels of the GZDoom indie scene, a passion project with depth, style, and world building you rarely see in the genre. It's dark, strange, atmospheric, and absolutely massive. If you want an FPS that feels like an adventure rather than a speedrun, this is the one that will hook you for hours. Beyond Sunset is one of the most stylish cyberpunk shooters ever built in GZDoom, a neon-drenched blend of Deus Ex, Ghost in the Shell, and classic fast-paced FPS movement. You play as a cyber-augmented samurai slicing and blasting your way through corporate ruins, glowing alleyways, techno slums, and neon towers that feel ripped straight from late 80s anime. What makes it hit immediately is the movement. Wall running, sliding, dashing, and chaining melee strikes in a gunfire creates this fluid, kinetic rhythm that feels closer to Titanfall than Doom. Every arena feels like a playground, and the game constantly encourages you to experiment with verticality instead of sitting safely behind corners. Combat mixes brutal katana attacks with high-tech firearms, and the dual-weapon loop is incredibly satisfying. Slash through melee fodder, dash across a ledge, then unload a full clip into heavier cyborg enemies. Bosses lean into spectacle more than pure mechanics, but they're memorable enough to keep you locked in. The world building is surprisingly strong too, with side characters, lore drops, and branching routes that give a setting real personality instead of just neon dressing. But for all its strengths, Beyond Sunset isn't without rough edges. Some levels feel overly ambitious, with layouts so large they occasionally lose momentum. The enemy variety is uneven, especially in mid-game sections where combat encounters blur together. Visual noise can get overwhelming. Neon, smoke, particles, and bullet trails sometimes stack until it's hard to read enemy attacks. The story pacing jumps around, touching on interesting themes but not always giving them room to breathe. Still, for pure style, speed, and cyberpunk energy, Beyond Sunset stands out as one of the most confident GZDoom projects ever. Apocalyptic Vibes takes GZDoom and flips it into a strange, atmospheric survival shooter that feels like a dream you barely remember. It blends 90s FPS vibes with immersive sim ideas, scrounging for supplies, navigating ruined industrial zones, talking to odd characters, and piecing together a world that feels broken in quiet, unsettling ways. The game doesn't rely on jump scares or constant combat. Instead, it builds tension through mood, empty parking garages, flickering lights, abandoned tunnels, rusted suburbs where you expect something to move even when nothing does. When enemies do appear, they hit hard, forcing you to approach fights more thoughtfully than in traditional boomer shooters. The writing leans into surreal conversations and strange humor, making the world feel like a mix of Stalker, Pathologic, and old-school ZDoom experiments. Levels are non-linear, with branching paths, side rooms filled with scraps of lore, and environmental storytelling that rewards careful exploration. You're not just blasting through halls. You're slowly unraveling a place that feels wrong in ways you can't fully name. The pacing is intentionally uneven, drifting between quiet stretches and sudden intensity, giving the game a hypnotic rhythm. But that same ambition creates its flaws. Some players find the slow sections too slow, especially if they come expecting non-stop shooting. A few objectives are vague, leaving you wandering for clues longer than necessary. Resource scarcity can create frustration if you mismanage supplies early. And the game's surreal tone might feel disjointed if you prefer a more grounded narrative. Yet those quirks are part of its charm. Apocalyptic Vibes thrives on strangeness, mood, and tension, offering something that feels unique in this space.